Wyoming Territory, 1881. The wind moved through the cottonwoods lining the creek like it carried a warning. Aurelia Keene stood barefoot in the dust outside the general store, her dress hem torn, her hands clenched. Her father had just signed her life away with a handshake and a bottle of rye. She was 19 and promised to a monster. 3 weeks, her father rasped, eyes red-rimmed with drink. You'll be his wife. You'll do what you're told. The man he gave her to Carver Holt stood tall and wide-shouldered beside his black gelding, his face like a carved rock. Everyone in town knew what he was. He had a cabin up in the hills built far from anyone. Folks whispered about screams in the night. No one dared go near. Her mouth was dry. I am not going with him. Her father only shrugged and walked off. The deal was done. Carver stepped forward, slow as a snake crossing hot stone. You're mine now. I'll come for you when I'm ready. You run, I'll find you. That was the first time she saw him. The second came sooner than she feared. 2 days later, a horse rode fast down from the ridge and stopped outside the livery. Every head turned when the rider dismounted. He was young, early 20s, maybe, and tall. His brown hair curled under the edge of a flat-brim hat, dust clinging to his long coat. His name was Callen Nash. He went to the blacksmith first, then the feed store, then into the saloon. Aurelia watched from behind the counter at the general store. Something about him made her chest ache, like he had seen worse than most but still stood straight. Did you see him? Asked Mrs. Daly, the postmaster's wife, whispering too loud. That's Callen Nash. Drove cattle through Comanche country. Shot 3 rustlers himself with one hand. They say he does not stay long anywhere. But Callen did not leave that night. He stayed at the boarding house across the street. She saw him again the next morning at the well. He held the bucket for her. You all right? He asked. She looked up. His eyes were dark, steady. He was not from here. He did not know. No, she said. I am promised to a man I do not want. That was all she said, but it was enough. By the end of the week, the whole town was whispering louder. Carver Holt had come down again. This time, he walked straight into the store, and Aurelia's hands trembled as she counted out change for a sack of flour. You try to run, he said low, close to her ear, and I'll gut you where you stand. The door opened behind him. Callen. He stepped inside with the sun behind him, casting his shadow long across the floor. His boots stopped just behind Carver's. You threatening her, Callen said, voice calm. Carver turned. This is not your concern. Callen's hand fell to the colt on his hip. No, it is, because she was promised to a monster. Carver stepped forward, his grin crooked and mean. She is mine by agreement. Callen tilted his head. No, she ain't. Aurelia's breath caught. The room fell silent. Then fast Carver reached for his holster. Callen already had his gun out. There was only one shot. Carver dropped to the floor, blood spreading across his chest. Callen stepped back, holstered his pistol, and looked at her. You coming or you want to stay? She nodded, her body shaking. I do not want to stay. They left before the sheriff arrived. No one stopped them. No one wanted to. They rode west, away from the hills and the fear. By nightfall, they had made it 20 miles to a small cabin near a stream, abandoned and dry-roofed. Callen broke the lock, lit the hearth, and gave her the cot. He took the floor. That night, she stared at the ceiling for hours. No man had ever stood between her and danger before. No man had ever looked at her like she was not something to claim. You killed him, she said into the quiet. He would have hurt you, Callen answered. She rolled to her side. You do not even know me. His voice came back low. I did not need to. The next morning, he chopped wood for a fire and brought her water to wash. When he saw the bruises on her arms, old ones, from her father, he did not speak, but his jaw tightened. They stayed in that cabin for 4 days, long enough for the town to stop looking. long enough for Aurelia to stop waking up afraid. He taught her how to shoot with his second revolver. She laughed when she missed every can on the fence, and he smiled for the first time. "Try again," he said, adjusting her hands. Their fingers touched. She looked up. His face was close. Her stomach turned, but not from fear. She liked the way he looked at her, like she was not something broken. On the fifth day, a rider came, a boy from the town. "Sheriff says you are not wanted. Man had no kin. Nobody is asking questions." Callen thanked him, gave him a coin, and shut the door. "So what now?" she asked. "I will take you wherever you want to go." She looked at the fire, at the way it lit his face. "I do not want to go anywhere you are not." He looked at her then. Not just looked, saw her, all of her. The fear, the strength. The girl who had no one and still stood. "You sure?" he asked. She nodded. He crossed the room, slow, careful. His fingers brushed her cheek. "Then you stay." And she did. She stayed. The snow started early that year, dusting the grasslands pale by late September. Callen patched the cabin roof with salvaged shingles from a broken barn half a day's ride south. And Aurelia spent the afternoon stitching new seams into the sleeves of her only winter coat. Neither of them said what it meant that they were staying through the cold, but the days settled into quiet rhythm, and the fire never went out at night. One morning, the creek froze over in a skin of ice so thin it cracked beneath a tossed pebble. Aurelia stood at its edge, shawl wrapped tight, watching her breath rise like smoke. "You ever trapped before?" Callen asked, walking up behind her with a pair of wooden snares hanging from his belt. She shook her head. "I've seen it done. My aunt in Laramie used to set lines for rabbits. She'd teach you how to clean one. I watched once. Smelled worse than I thought it would." Callen crouched near the bank and began setting one of the snares. His hands moved with sure, practiced motion. "It's different when you have to eat what you kill, makes you careful." She crouched beside him. "Did you always live like this?" Started young. "My mother died birthing my sister. Pa couldn't raise a baby alone, so she went to kin in Kansas. I stayed with him, moving stock, sleeping in tents, sometimes sleeping nowhere. He drank too much. By the time I was 15, I'd left." Aurelia picked up a smooth stone and rolled it between her fingers. "You ever go back?" "Nothing to go back to." The wind snapped along the creek. She looked over. He was watching her, not the trap. "You miss her?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. "I don't remember her face, just the way she used to hum when she thought no one was listening." Aurelia placed the stone on the ground. "I used to close my eyes and pretend my mother was still alive. I'd pretend she'd come back and take me away from him. Every time I heard a wagon on the road, I'd think it was her. I'm sorry. I stopped waiting when I turned 10. That was the year he broke my collarbone." Callen didn't reach for her, didn't speak. Just stayed beside her until the silence settled soft again. That night, she cooked squirrel stew with wild onions and a pinch of salt he'd bartered from a peddler the week before. They ate by lantern light, the cabin warm from the firewood he'd stacked high behind the hearth. "You ever think about what comes next?" she asked as she scraped the last of the broth from her tin plate. "I try not to." "I do." He leaned back in the chair, his face unreadable. "What do you see?" "I want hens in the yard. A dog that don't bark too much. A table big enough for more than two, maybe a sewing room." He set his plate down. "That yours or something you heard in a story?" "It's mine," she said. "But you don't have to want the same." He didn't speak for a long time. Then, "I want land that's mine and quiet that doesn't mean danger. I want to wake up and know I ain't running from anything." She ran her finger along the rim of her cup. "You're not." "Not anymore." He looked at her then, and something shifted between them, slow and certain. Not a spark, but a steady warmth, like coals banked for the night. Later, when the snow came heavier, they moved the bed closer to the hearth. She offered to sleep on the floor. He didn't let her. I ain't ever touched a woman that didn't want me to, he said quietly, laying his blanket on the floor. And I'm not starting now. I know, she said, and meant it. But that night, when the wind howled through the chinks in the wall and the cold crept in beneath the door, she slipped from the bed and lay down beside him. She didn't speak, just curled close and placed her hand over his heart. He didn't move away. He covered her hand with his, and they fell asleep like that together, not tangled, but near enough to feel the promise of more. Morning broke clear and sharp, the world outside blanketed in white. She opened her eyes to find him already awake, watching the light crawl across the floorboards. "You ever been in love?" she asked without turning. He was quiet. Then, "No, but I think I might be learning." She turned to face him. "Teach me too." He smiled, soft and slow, and nodded once. They got up, dressed in wool and canvas, and stepped out into the snow side by side. The air smelled clean. The traps would need checking. Wood would need chopping. But the day belonged to them, and for the first time in either of their lives the future did too. The thaw came gradual, days lengthening one stitch at a time. The snow didn't vanish all at once, it shrank back in wet clumps, leaving behind a softened earth and the smell of pine bark warming in the sun. Callen built a lean-to beside the cabin for splitting firewood, and Aurelia began tending a patch of ground where the soil had turned loose enough to work. She dug in with her bare hands until her nails filled with mud, her breath puffing in the cool air. "You mean to plant something?" Callen asked, watching her from the porch rail, arms crossed. "If I can get it to grow," she said. "Used to watch the neighbor lady back in Laramie pull carrots straight from the ground. I thought they looked like magic." He stepped down, boots crunching frostbitten grass. "We'll need seed." "I know. I was thinking of riding to Buffalo next week, Mr. Oates said there's a wagon coming in from Cheyenne with spring goods." He hesitated. "It's a long ride alone." "I didn't say I was going alone." They left before dawn the next Thursday, riding double on his gelding with a sack of dried meat and last season's apples wrapped in cloth. Buffalo lay nearly 30 miles north, a long way, but not too far if the weather held and the creeks ran low. They crossed the Powder River by noon, its waters calm and shallow over the stones, and reached town with the sky just starting to burn gold. Aurelia had only seen Buffalo once before, and then only from the back of her father's wagon. Now the streets looked different, wider, less threatening. She noticed the chipped paint on the hotel shutters and the rows of boots hanging in front of the cobbler's shop. A pair of young boys chased each other with willow switches, laughing too loud and dodging horses. Callen stopped in front of the mercantile. "I'll check the saddlery. Meet you back here when you're done," she nodded, stepping down from the horse. "Don't hurry." Inside, she scanned the shelves for seed packets, radish, turnip, beans. Her fingers lingered on a folded sack of tobacco before she moved on. There was a woman behind the counter, mid-40s, with graying hair pulled into a tight knot and a scar that ran from her ear to her jaw. "Looking for something in particular?" the woman asked. "Something that'll grow in shallow soil." The woman cocked her head. "Not much will, but beans are forgiving. You new to the area?" Aurelia paused. "Not new, just not gone yet." The woman's gaze sharpened. "You with someone?" Aurelia straightened. "I am." "Good," the woman said. "Too many girls come through here alone, get taken by men who think no means maybe." She didn't reply, just paid for the seed and stepped outside, the door swinging shut behind her. Callen waited by the horse, a new bridle looped over his arm. He watched her approach, his eyes flicking to the bag in her hands. "Find what you wanted." "Mostly," she said. "Woman inside asked if I was with someone." He looked past her toward the store window. "She give you trouble?" "No." She was kind, just cautious. They stayed at the livery's loft that night, wrapped in their coats with a lantern burning low beside them. The hay scratched through their blankets, but neither complained. She lay beside him, shoulder brushing his, and listened to the horses shifting below. "You remember the first thing you thought when you saw me?" she asked. He didn't look at her. "I thought you looked cornered." She nodded slowly. "I was. You're not anymore, I know. I just don't always feel it." He turned to her then, his face close in the dim. "That'll come." She reached for his hand, fingers threading through his. "You ever think about staying in one place for good? I do now." They rode home with the wind softer at their backs. The sound of the horses' hooves over packed dirt filled the space between them, but it wasn't silence, it was comfort. By the time the cabin came into view, she had already decided where to put the bean rows. That evening, she lit the lantern while he unbuckled the saddle. She poured the seeds into a shallow tin, running her thumb over them like they were coins. He stepped inside, brushing dirt from his trousers. "You decide where to plant." She looked up at him, heat rising to her cheeks. "I thought maybe beside the south wall, it gets the most sun." He nodded. "Good place for something to start." And when he leaned in, slow and steady, and kissed her for the first time, she tasted the warmth of everything they'd built between them, quiet, steady, and real. There was no rush in it, no fear. Just his hand at her waist and hers at his collar, and the soft weight of spring settling around them. The beans pushed through the soil by late April, green shoots curling toward the sun. Aurelia knelt in the garden at dawn, brushing dirt away from the roots with careful fingers. Her apron was damp to the knees, and a sliver of hair had slipped from her braid, clinging to her cheek. She didn't brush it back. The morning was still, and she liked how the quiet felt clean and wide as the sky. Callen came around the side of the cabin carrying a narrow board and a tin of nails. "Fence rails rotted through behind the lean-to," he said. "I'll mend it before the mule gets curious." "Came up on the porch again?" she asked. "Left teeth marks in the salt barrel." She smiled, standing to stretch her back. "We'll have to tie her farther off until we can build the pen." He nodded and knelt to set his tools down, the sun catching the edge of his jaw as he worked. She watched the way he measured the board against the bent post, how his movements stayed deliberate, like he'd learned not to waste effort. There was something in that steadiness she trusted more than any promise, something solid. By mid-afternoon, the wind shifted from the north, carrying the scent of wet bark and iron. Aurelia stepped onto the porch with a hand shading her eyes. Storms rolling in. Callen hammered the last nail into place and straightened, glancing toward the distant ridgeline where the clouds had begun to ripple dark across the horizon. "We've got an hour, maybe less." They moved in rhythm, practiced now coiling the rope lines, banking the fire, closing the shutters. He checked the roof patch and she brought in the wash, wringing out damp linens and hanging them from the rafters inside. When the first drops hit the roof, they were already seated at the table, her sewing basket between them, his rifle leaning against the doorframe. Rain fell hard and fast, drumming the boards in steady rhythm. Thunder rolled low, shaking the windows in their panes. "Do you ever miss the trail?" she asked, threading her needle. He looked up, brow furrowed. "Sometimes. The way the stars looked out past the canyon lands, the quiet after a drive when the only sound was the cattle settling." She nodded, pulling the thread through a hem. "I think I'd miss this place if I left it." "You would," he said. "You made it yours." She set the shirt aside and looked at him. "We made it." He held her gaze. "I've stayed longer here than anywhere since I was 16. You think you'll stay for good? I already have." The words weren't loud, but they landed with weight. She reached across the table and laid her hand over his. His fingers turned under hers, palm to palm, warm and certain. That night, Once the storm passed and the sky cleared to a dull silver, they lay in bed side by side, the window cracked open to let in the smell of rain-soaked pine. "I used to think love was something that happened fast," she whispered, tracing a line along his forearm. "Like a fever." He turned toward her, his voice low. "I used to think it didn't happen at all," she smiled into the dark. "You were wrong. So were you." She leaned in and kissed him, slow and without hesitation. It wasn't a beginning. It was something already rooted, grown quiet and deep. In the weeks that followed, the days lengthened, and the garden thickened with broad leaves and climbing tendrils. Callen traded 2 tanned hides for a goat with a woman outside Casey, and Aurelia built a pen from downed limbs and old nails. They dug a second row for corn and cleared a patch for pumpkins. He carved a cradle from pine in the evenings, working by lantern light while she hemmed linens. Neither of them said what it meant yet, but the cradle stood ready in the corner by the hearth. One evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the mountains in copper and rose, she stood at the edge of the field, hands folded over her belly. Callen came up beside her, silent. She turned to him. "Do you still think you're learning?" He brushed a wind-blown piece of hair from her face. "Every day." "I think," she said, resting her hand against his chest, "we're building something no one can take." He kissed her then, not out of want, but belonging. The kind of kiss that said home, that said earned. And behind them the cabin stood sturdy, windows glowing warm, garden thick with life. The sky was wide and the road behind them was long, but they had come through it. Together. The summer came in slow, the way a song does when the first notes are still finding their shape. Grass grew tall around the fence line, bending easy under the weight of bees. Aurelia woke each morning to the chirr of swallows nesting in the eaves and the steady thud of Callen's boots as he stepped outside to bring in water. They'd learned the rhythm of the land now, each day folding into the next with the comfort of knowing what came after. One morning, she crouched beside the pumpkin vines, brushing away a beetle with the edge of her sleeve, when the sound of hooves carried from the east ridge. She stood, shading her eyes. A single rider approached, dust trailing behind like a torn ribbon. Callen came from the barn, wiping his hands on his trousers, eyes narrowing toward the horizon. The man reined in just short of the house, sweat streaking his bay's flanks. "You Callen Nash?" he asked, voice hoarse from the road. Callen stepped forward. "I am." The man dismounted stiffly. "Name's Raleigh. I rode from Miles City. There's word out of Sioux Falls some fella named Mercer's been asking after you. Says he's got a claim on a trail debt out of Fort Kearney." Callen's jaw tightened, but he didn't look away. "I don't owe Mercer anything but silence." Raleigh glanced toward Aurelia, then back. "You want me to carry a message back?" Callen shook his head. "No. Let him find a new ghost." The man nodded once, climbed back onto his horse and rode out without another word. When the dust had settled, Aurelia stepped beside Callen. "You want to tell me what that was?" Callen rubbed a hand over the back of his neck. "Old trouble. Before I found you. Is it going to follow us here?" He looked at her then, steady. "Not if I stand where I belong." She didn't ask more. She didn't need to. Instead, she took him by the hand and led him inside, where the lantern still hung beside the hearth and the floor creaked in familiar ways. She pulled a tin from the shelf and set it on the table. "Help me measure out for supper," she said. "If there's going to be trouble, it'll find us fed." By the end of that week, the pumpkins had begun to swell round and dappled beneath the leaves, and the goat had taken to sleeping just outside the door, nose tucked beneath its flank. Callen spent his evenings finishing the cradle, sanding the edges smooth and carving a small pine branch along the headboard. One night, as she mended the hem of a shirt too small to fit either of them, Aurelia rested a hand against her belly and said, I think it'll be a girl." Callen looked up from his work. "How do you know?" she smiled. "I don't, but I feel it. She'll be stubborn." He set down his blade. "Then she'll be strong, and she'll want to climb everything. She'll skin her knees before she's 5. Aurelia laughed, the sound soft and full. "And she'll ask questions you won't know how to answer." "I'll learn," he said. "If she's anything like her mother, I'll learn." They didn't speak of Mercer again. The days passed in honest labor. Callen cleared more land near the creek, and Aurelia started drying herbs from the patch behind the cabin. One afternoon, a wagon passed through, driven by a traveling preacher and his wife. They stopped for water and left with a sack of beans and a promise to return before harvest. The preacher had offered them a blessing before he left. Aurelia had nodded, but Callen had taken her hand in his and said, "We're already blessed. You just helped us name it." Come September, the baby arrived in the early hours under a sky bright with stars. No midwife found the cabin in time, but it didn't matter. Callen knelt beside her, hands steady, voice low and sure, and when the child came into the world, red-faced and squalling, it was Callen who caught her, Callen who wrapped her in soft linen, Callen who whispered her name. They named her Lark. Aurelia held her daughter close, sweat drying cold on her skin, and watched as Callen rocked the cradle he'd built with his own hands. He looked at the baby like someone who'd been waiting his whole life to meet her. "You ever think we'd come this far?" she asked, voice raw. He looked up, eyes full. "I didn't know what far was until you." The first frost came 3 weeks later. Callen shuttered the windows tight and Aurelia lined the cradle with wool. Lark slept easy, her tiny breath soft as wind through cotton. By winter's end, the garden lay quiet under snow, but inside the cabin there was warmth enough for 3. They made room always. Room for laughter, for learning, for the weight of love that didn't ask permission. Years passed. Callen built a second room. Aurelia taught Lark to read with the same books she'd once hidden in her apron folds. They raised chickens, traded for flour and sugar, and took turns reading the sky for weather. Trouble never came back. Mercer faded like a name carved too shallow in stone. On their 7th spring, Callen cleared a patch of land down by the creek and built a bench beneath the cottonwoods. That's where they sat most evenings, watching Lark chase sunlight between the trees. "I never thought I'd live a life where the days felt long enough," Aurelia said one twilight, her head resting against his shoulder. He kissed her temple slow. "That's what happens when you build it together." She laced her fingers with his. "We did more than build it. We chose it." Every time. And side by side, with the hush of leaves overhead and the laughter of their daughter in the distance, they watched the day settle into peace. They never left the land. Never needed to. Everything they were was here, rooted deep, held steady and growing still.